Yesterday, out of the blue, my brother-in-law asked my wife if she could meet him for lunch. He said there was something he needed to talk to her about. When my wife told me about his invitation, she seemed puzzled, but not overly concerned. "Do you think it's about my sister?" she asked, furrowing her brow. "Maybe they're having problems, and he wants to get a woman's perspective on things." I found the whole situation odd. My brother-in-law had never reached out to my wife in this way before. However, he often texted her and other family members for mundane reasons, so I didn't think much of it. After all, we were a close-knit family, and it wasn't unusual for us to support each other through tough times. "Go find out," I told her, shrugging off my initial unease. My wife agreed, deciding to meet him at a cafe near her office the next day. The next morning, as she was getting ready for work, she mentioned lunch again. "I'm still not sure what this is about," she said, a hint of worry in her voice. I reassured her, saying it was probably nothing serious. "Just listen to what he has to say, and if it's something we need to help with, we'll figure it out together," I said. The cafe was busy, filled with the usual lunchtime crowd, and my wife felt a bit more at ease being in such a public setting. She arrived early, finding a table near the window where she could keep an eye on the entrance. He arrived a few minutes later, looking more nervous than she'd ever seen him. They exchanged the usual pleasantries, talking about work and the kids for a few minutes, but then, as soon as their food arrived, he took a deep breath and dove into what he really came to say. He started by complimenting her, telling her how beautiful she looked. At first, she thought he was just being polite, but then he kept going. He told her how she'd always been the light in his life and how she made him feel things he'd never felt before. "It was love at first sight," he said, his voice trembling slightly. "I've loved you since the moment I first laid eyes on you. If you were mine, I would treat you like the queen you are. I'd give you everything you deserve." My wife was stunned. She stared at him, unable to believe what she was hearing. This man, my brother-in-law, married to my sister and father of their 2 kids, was pouring his heart out to her. He made grand promises about how different life would be if they were together, going on about how he'd been holding these feelings in for years, how he'd watched her and admired her from afar, feeling more and more that they were meant to be together. She tried to interrupt to tell him he was making a huge mistake, but he kept talking over her, almost as if he'd rehearsed this speech 1,000 times in his head. This man had always had a friendly relationship with my wife. Our families saw each other often since we were a close-knit bunch. He'd always been the fun uncle to our kids, the guy who was there at every family barbecue, every holiday dinner. He texted my wife frequently, but it was always about mundane things, kids' schedules, family events, nothing overly personal. To hear my wife recount this to me felt like a punch to the gut. She didn't let him finish. She stood up, her chair scraping loudly against the floor, and walked out, shaking as she called me to tell me everything that just happened. While she was on the phone with me, the text from him started. First were apologies. He didn't mean it. He thought it was only infatuation, and he was sorry for making her uncomfortable. But the damage was done. She left work early to come home and talk to me about this, her phone buzzing incessantly with his calls and messages. I told her to answer one of his calls and put him on speaker so I could hear. He was crying, begging her not to tell my sister. He kept saying it was a mistake, that he misread signals, that he thought she felt the same way. Apparently, during a family gathering the previous weekend, he thought my wife was flirting with him, claiming they had a moment alone in our kitchen where he felt a connection. While I could see how some of my wife's behavior might have been misinterpreted, this was beyond anything we could have imagined. He asked if she told me, and I answered yes, as I was on speaker. Then he started begging me too, pleading for us to keep this a secret. This went on for a while, him begging and us listening. My main question was whether he had cheated on my sister before. He swore he hadn't, insisting that it was just my wife. He said I should understand that it was her, only her. At that point, I was done listening. I told him I wasn't going to do anything tonight and that I'd call him tomorrow. Now we were left with this mess, not knowing what to do next. My wife said we should drive over there right now and tell my sister, but the idea of wrecking my sister's family was killing me. Thinking about what this would do to my nieces made me want to vomit. I knew the right thing to do was to tell my sister, but I was also thinking about my wife. It wasn't her fault, but there would surely be resentment from my family, even if my sister didn't divorce him and they reconciled. I couldn't see how we'd ever be together again like we were before, if at all. This whole episode could tear my family apart. I didn't care about him. He tried to destroy my family, but I did care about everyone else. Update. So, everyone who told me last night that I couldn't wait to tell my sister was right. A little after 12, I got a call from my sister. She sounded upset and said she had to tell me something. My heart sank as she explained that her husband, my brother-in-law, had come to her in tears, claiming my wife had tried to begin an affair with him. He spun a tale where my wife was the instigator, trying to shift the blame entirely onto her. I could hardly believe what I was hearing. I immediately told my sister that wasn't the case and assured her I would be right over. This situation needed to be addressed face to face, not over the phone. I hung up and, with a sense of urgency, called my parents. I woke my mother and father, explaining what was happening in quick, clipped sentences. My father was furious, and my mother sounded shocked but resolute. They agreed to head over to my sister's house to sit with her kids, offering the support she would desperately need right now. Next, I called my younger brother. He groggily answered, confusion turning to alarm as I filled him in. He promised to come over to our place and stay with our kids, ensuring they wouldn't be left alone during this turmoil. His calm, steady presence would be a comfort to them. Meanwhile, my wife was already gathering her things, her face pale and drawn. She was dreading the confrontation, but knew it was necessary. We left the house in a hurry, the drive to my sister's place feeling longer than it actually was. The silence in the car was heavy, both of us lost in our thoughts. When we arrived, the scene was even more tense than I had imagined. My sister was out on the front porch with my brother-in-law when we got there. He looked beaten, eyes downcast, his posture slumped in defeat. He knew we had the texts and voicemails, the undeniable proof of his betrayal. I really didn't know what he was hoping to accomplish by calling my sister in the middle of the night with his lies. Maybe he thought he could get ahead of the story, twist the narrative to save himself, but it was a futile effort. As we walked up to them, the tension in the air was palpable. My wife was trembling, her face a mask of controlled anger and hurt. She handed my sister her phone without a word. My sister took it, her hands steady but her eyes burning with a mix of fury and pain. She scrolled through the texts, her expression hardening with each one she read. Then she listened to the voicemails, the damning evidence of his declarations and her refusals. Before she could say anything, my brother-in-law started sobbing. This was a man who runs into burning buildings, who faces danger daily without flinching. Seeing him like this, broken and vulnerable, was jarring. His cries were deep and guttural, raw with regret and fear. It was a scene that was almost surreal, a big, tough firefighter brought to his knees by his own actions. My sister's face remained impassive, a mask of stern resolve. She had always been tough, but right now she was unyielding. She waited for him to finish, her silence more powerful than any words. When he finally quieted down, still hiccuping with the remnants of his sobs, she spoke. "Pack a bag and go," she said, her voice cold and clear. "I can't stand to look at you." He tried to argue, to plead his case, but she was having none of it. "Stop it," she snaps, cutting through his words. "There's nothing you can say that will make this better." She turns away from him, walks over to my wife, and pulls her into a hug. It's a moment of solidarity between them, a small comfort in the middle of this nightmare. They've been friends since college, and the strength of their bond is evident. It's a relief to see that, despite everything, they're standing together. This leaves me standing with my brother-in-law. He's a wreck, his face red and swollen from crying, his shoulders slumped. He looks at me, his eyes pleading for some kind of understanding or forgiveness, but I have none to offer. He tries to speak, his voice cracking, but I cut him off. "You need to leave," I say firmly. "This is your mess. You need to deal with the consequences." He nods, defeated, and slowly makes his way inside to pack his things. My sister stays with my wife, the two of them talking quietly, leaning on each other for support. The rest of the night is a blur of conversations and plans. We all rally around my sister, helping her figure out what to do next and how to protect her kids from the fallout. My sister begins questioning my wife, trying to understand why her husband thought any of this could possibly work out. He must have had some reason to believe she reciprocated his feelings, she insists. There hadn't been any issues in their marriage. Everything had been normal. My wife is crying at this point, tears streaming down her face as she tries to make sense of the situation. "There's nothing you haven't seen," she says, her voice shaking. She hands my sister her phone again, and together they painstakingly go through every text message sent over the past 2 years. They read each one carefully, looking for any hint of inappropriate behavior, but there's nothing there. My wife was just being herself. She has a playful personality, always joking around and teasing. It's part of what makes her so lovable and approachable. My brother-in-law has a similar sense of humor, and they've always teased each other in a lighthearted, harmless way. She does the same with my mom and my younger brother. It's just how she interacts with people. The only incident my wife can think of that might have been misconstrued happened this past weekend. She recounts it, trying to pinpoint where things went wrong. They were all together at our place, and she and my brother-in-law both reached for the fridge at the same time. They playfully jostled for who would get there first, laughing as they did so. He let her win, but then he reached around her waist to grab a beer, moving his hand slowly. She admits that in that moment, the way he did it felt a little inappropriate. It was a fleeting feeling, and she brushed it off, not wanting to make a big deal out of it. She wonders now if her silence gave him some misguided hope. My sister listens, her expression softening. She doesn't blame my wife for any of this. She knows her well enough to understand that her playful nature isn't an invitation for anything more. It's not your fault, she reassures her, and my wife nods, though the guilt still lingers. As they finish reading through the messages, it's clear there was never any mutual attraction, no hidden signals or secret flirtations. My wife was just being herself, and my brother-in-law took that and twisted it into something it wasn't. The realization that this misunderstanding has caused so much pain is almost too much to bear, but at least for now, my sister's belief in my wife remains intact. Then my sister starts going through his MacBook to see what else she doesn't know about. She's angry and frantic at this point, her hands shaking as she types. She guesses the password, and on the third try, she's in. With a deep breath, she starts searching through his files, looking for anything that might shed more light on this nightmare. It doesn't take long before she finds something disturbing. There, buried in a folder labeled innocuously, are a lot of pictures of my wife. They date back years, and what's more unsettling is that they're always isolated shots, just her, never in group settings or candid family moments. My sister clicks through them, her anger turning into a cold, creeping horror. One set of photos stands out. A few years ago, we went on a couple's trip to the Caribbean. It was a rare vacation without the kids, and my wife, feeling more relaxed in the adults-only environment, had worn a bikini. She usually doesn't, preferring more modest swimwear, but this time she felt comfortable enough to do so. There were probably 50 pictures of her in that bikini, each one taken without her knowledge. My sister's face pales as she scrolls through them. It's clear he's been secretly snapping these photos for years, collecting them obsessively. The realization that he's been harboring this fixation, lurking in the shadows of family events, sends a shiver down her spine. Does this now enter restraining order territory? She wonders aloud, her voice barely above a whisper. This has taken a creepy turn far beyond what any of us had imagined. The boundary between inappropriate and outright disturbing has been crossed. She calls us over, showing us the pictures. My wife gasps, her hand flying to her mouth in shock. She had no idea he was doing this, no inkling of his obsession. My sister, her anger now tempered by a deep sense of betrayal, starts talking about next steps, legal action, protection for her kids, and a restraining order. All possibilities that need to be considered. Now we're all reeling from this new discovery. The man we thought we knew, who we trusted as a husband, a father, and a brother-in-law, has shown a side of himself that's dark and disturbing. It's not just a matter of infatuation anymore. It's something far more insidious. Unfortunately, the mess continues. My sister agreed to talk to her husband last night and let him explain himself. She was determined to get the full story and decided to involve my wife directly to ensure there would be no lying or half-truths. They set up a FaceTime call with my wife, and I listened in off-camera, my heart pounding with a mix of anger and dread. My sister, ever thorough, recorded the entire conversation for good measure. As soon as the call began, the tension was palpable. My brother-in-law looked exhausted, his eyes red-rimmed and swollen from crying. He started hesitantly, his voice shaky, but as he spoke, the truth began to pour out, and the story unfolded in a way none of us had fully anticipated. He admitted he had been infatuated with my wife for years. It started the day I met her, he confessed, his voice barely above a whisper. He explained that during one of those early gatherings, where my sister was eager to introduce her new boyfriend to her friends, he had come along. My wife and I were dating at the time, but he had met her before he met me. At first, he thought his feelings were purely physical, an innocent crush that he could brush aside. But as time went on and he spent more time around her, he realized it was more than that. He became fixated on her personality, her laughter, and the way she interacted with everyone. He described moments where he found himself captivated by her presence, even as she was just being herself, playful and kind. He detailed how he tried to suppress these feelings, convincing himself they were harmless, but over time, his infatuation grew. He started finding ways to be near her more often, volunteering for family events and making excuses to text her about trivial things. It was a slow, insidious process that eventually led him to believe he needed to confess his feelings, deluding himself into thinking she might feel the same way. My sister listened, her face a mask of controlled rage and heartbreak. She didn't interrupt him, allowing him to reveal everything. My wife, on the other hand, was visibly shaken. Hearing how long this had been going on and how deeply his feelings ran was almost too much for her to bear. When he finished, there was a heavy silence. My sister finally spoke, her voice icy and measured. "What made you think my wife would leave me for you?" she asked, her eyes boring into his. He stammered, struggling to find the right words, mentioning the supposed mutual attraction and moments he had misinterpreted as signs of her reciprocation. At that point, my wife and sister erupted in frustration, their pent-up anger spilling over. The raw emotion of betrayal and hurt was palpable. My wife hung up the call, trembling and pale, concerned for me and for us, assuring me repeatedly that the attraction was one-sided. I believed her, always had. Even if she found him attractive at some point, I knew she would never act on it. She was serious about trust and fidelity, values she made clear early on in our relationship. As I replayed the chaotic scene in my mind, I couldn't help but reflect on my brother-in-law. I knew he was a bit cocky, always walking with a certain swagger, but I never realized he thought so highly of himself that he could pursue something like this. His delusions were staggering, completely detached from reality. Later, I talked to my sister once the initial shock had started to wear off. She was determined to protect her children from the fallout of her husband's actions. She told me she would be contacting a lawyer first thing Monday morning to see what steps she could take to limit his exposure to their kids. Her focus was now entirely on their well-being. My brother-in-law returned home yesterday, not because my sister wanted him back, but because she couldn't legally stop him. Despite the turmoil, he had the right to be in the house until the legal proceedings moved forward. The atmosphere was tense, filled with unspoken words and palpable resentment. It was clear he realized that any hope he had of salvaging their marriage was gone. The lawyer informed my sister that since his behavior had been documented, there was a good chance she would be granted full custody of the kids. The texts, voicemails, and disturbing photos painted a clear picture of his obsession. He didn't seem inclined to fight her on that, almost as if he knew he had lost everything. My sister was strong. She moved through the house with determination, focusing on her children and their future. The kids sensed something was wrong, but didn't know the details. My brother-in-law had never been around much, often working long hours. His absence was a constant in their lives, but it would still be hard for them once they understood what was happening. She had already spoken to a child psychologist to help them navigate the inevitable questions and emotions. My sister was ready to provide them with the love and support they needed. As for my brother-in-law, he stayed in the guest room, a silent figure in a house that no longer felt like his home. He seems resigned to his fate, going through the motions, but devoid of any real fight. It's a sad, pitiful sight, but my sympathy is limited. Some of my friends have suggested that someone as obsessive as my brother-in-law couldn't have fixated on just one person. However, as far as we can tell, there hasn't been anyone else. His obsession with my wife has been singular and intense, leaving no room for anyone else. After everything came to light, my wife blocked his phone number to create some distance and protect herself from his unwanted advances. However, on the same night he returned home, he sent my wife an email from an account he had just created. It started with a seemingly sincere apology, but quickly turned into something much darker. He began by saying he never got to finish his thoughts at the restaurant that day, implying there was more he needed to confess. Then he launched into paragraphs about all the things he loves about my wife. He detailed the desperation he felt and the overwhelming emotions that had driven him to act irrationally. He recounted every little detail he admired about her, her smile, her laugh, the way she interacted with others. It was unsettling to see his obsession laid out so starkly. He mentioned their supposed mutual attraction again, insisting that there was a palpable connection between them that he had always felt. He was delusional, mistaking her friendly, playful nature for something more. He painted a picture of a connection that existed only in his mind, a fantasy he had convinced himself was real. The email ended with a rather surprising section about me. Let's just say I didn't know he had such a low opinion of me. He was certain that I was not satisfying my wife properly, criticizing everything from my appearance to my demeanor and implying that I was somehow unworthy of her. His words were meant to undermine me, sowing seeds of doubt and insecurity. Reading the email was a gut punch. It was clear that his obsession had twisted his perceptions and fueled his disdain for me. He saw me as an obstacle, someone unworthy of the woman he had placed on a pedestal. But instead of feeling threatened, it only solidified my resolve to protect my wife and my family from his delusions. We forwarded the email to my sister and her lawyer. It was more evidence of his unstable state of mind, another piece of the puzzle that showed just how far gone he was. This email, with its mix of apology, obsession, and criticism, might be enough to get him removed from the house permanently. For now, my wife and I are taking it one day at a time. The support from our friends and family has been invaluable, helping us navigate this surreal and painful situation. My wife isn't doing great, but she is improving each day. She feels guilty for being too comfortable around my brother-in-law. Normally, she is very careful about setting boundaries with other men. If it wasn't clear, my wife is quite stunning and receives a lot of male attention. However, she felt safe around my brother-in-law because he was family and never thought he would cross any lines. Fortunately, she and my sister are on good terms, and there doesn't seem to be any resentment, which is a relief. We will all be okay, but it will take time. Thank you to everyone who commented and offered their support. My primary concern throughout this has been my sister and her children. The impact of my brother-in-law's actions on their lives is immense. Ensuring their protection and emotional well-being has become our priority. Children especially need shielding from such toxic situations to maintain their sense of security and normalcy. When faced with a situation like this, it's essential to act quickly and decisively. We didn't hesitate to gather evidence, confront the issue, and involve legal help to ensure the safety and well-being of everyone involved. Procrastination or denial could have led to further harm.